Okay, the dominant model is not consistent with basic ethics. Previously, we have argued that most theories of business rely on separating business decisions from ethical decisions. This is seen most clearly in the popular joke about business ethics as an oxymoron. More formally, we might suggest that we define the separation fallacy. I actually prefer to call this the separation thesis. Freeman is going to ultimately reject it, so he thinks it's wrong, so he thinks it's a fallacy in that sense. But just to get started, it's maybe better just to think of it as a thesis that we want to consider. But in any case, it is useful to believe that sentences like X is a business decision have no ethical content or any implicit ethical point of view, and it is useful to believe that sentences like X is an ethical decision and the best thing to do, all things considered, have no content or implicit view about value creation and trade, that is, about business. Okay, so the separation thesis is saying that if we're talking about something being a business decision, then there can't be any ethical content or moral dimension to that decision. And at the same time, if we're talking about something being a moral decision, something being morally acceptable or morally unacceptable, then we can't be talking about business. Okay, so the point is just that those two categories, those two realms are separate. This fallacy, or this thesis, underlies much of the dominant story about business, as well as in other areas in society. There are two implications of rejecting the separation thesis. The first is that almost any business decision has some ethical content. To see that this is true, one need only ask whether the following questions make sense for virtually any business decision. Okay, so we have 1 through 4 here. Number 1, if this decision is made, for whom is value created and destroyed? 2, who is harmed and or benefited by this decision? 3, whose rights are enabled and whose values are realized by this decision and whose are not? And 4, what kind of person will I or we become if we make this decision? Okay, so what these 4 questions are illustrating is that we can talk about a business decision and the ethical implications of that decision. We can combine those two categories, the moral and the business, and whatever it is we might be talking about is going to make sense. So just as an illustration or as an example, consider, something like, what time is the blue table? Now that sentence doesn't make sense because I'm trying to combine two categories, time and tables, that don't have anything to do with each other. The two categories just shouldn't be or can't be combined into one coherent sentence. Okay, but what 1 through 4 illustrates is that we can combine moral concerns and questions about business, and we can do that coherently. Okay, since these questions are always open for most business decisions, it is reasonable to give up the separation fallacy. Okay, so if 1 through 4 make sense, which they do, then it has to be the case that the separation thesis is false. These two categories, the ethical and the business, are not separate. Okay, the separation thesis would have us believe that these questions aren't relevant for making business decisions or that they could never be answered. We need a theory about business that builds in answers to the open question argument, that is, that builds in answers to these kinds of questions. One such answer would be only value to shareholders counts, but such an answer would have to be enmeshed in the language of ethics as well as business. Milton Freeman, unlike most of his expositors, that is, the people who have talked about and defended the article of Friedman's that we read, and maybe other things that Freeman wrote, Milton Friedman may actually give such a morally rich answer. He claims that the responsibility of the executive is to make profits subject to law and ethical custom. Depending on how law and ethical custom is interpreted, the key difference with the stakeholder approach may well be that we disagree about how the world works. In order to create value, we believe that it is better to focus on integrating business and ethics within a complex set of stakeholder relationships rather than treating ethics as a side constraint on making profits. Okay, so the idea for a side constraint is, so we can picture or just imagine that the moral rules or guidelines that we have are like the sidelines on a playing field, a football field, say. And so the idea is that we have to stay in bounds. We don't want to cross those moral guidelines or those moral rules. So in that sense, the moral guidelines are a side constraint. Whatever we do within them is fine as long as we don't cross them. Okay, so that's one option. Freeman is going to prefer this integration idea. So the integration thesis: most business decisions or sentences about business have some ethical content or implicit ethical view. Most ethical decisions or sentences about ethics have some business content or implicit view about business. Okay, so the idea here is just that the two are integrated or completely enmeshed. It's almost always the case that when we're talking about business decisions, there's some moral component to those decisions. Maybe not in every single case, but at least a lot of the time. One of the most pressing challenges facing business scholars is to tell compelling narratives that have the integration thesis at its heart. This is essentially the task that a group of scholars, business ethicists, and stakeholder theorists have begun over the last 30 years. We need to go back to the very basics of ethics. Ethics is about the rules, principles, consequences, matters of character, etc., that we use to live together. These ideas give us a set of open questions that we are constantly searching for better ways to answer in reasonably complete ways. One might define ethics as a conversation about how we can reason together and solve our differences, recognize where our interests are joined, and need development so that we can all flourish without resorting to coercion and violence. Okay, so you guys have read What is Ethics Anyway? So you have an idea of what ethics is. Here, Freeman is just giving us a very general characterization of what he has in mind. I don't think that he would really disagree with anything that is in What is Ethics Anyway, but he wants to focus in particular on this idea that ethics is a conversation about how we can reason together and solve our differences. Okay, so that we can all flourish without resorting to coercion and violence. So some may disagree with such a definition. We do not intend to privilege definitions, but such a pragmatist approach to ethics entails that we reason and talk together to try and create a better world for all of us. If our critiques of the dominant model are correct, then we need to start over by reconceptualizing the very language that we use to understand how business operates. We want to suggest that something like the following principle is implicit in most of the reasonably comprehensive views about ethics. The responsibility principle: most people, most of the time, want to actually do and should accept responsibility for the effects of their actions on others. Okay, so the idea here is we have, on the one hand, utilitarianism and the principle about maximizing happiness. We have the categorical imperative. We have the other theories, rights, virtue ethics, so on and so forth. The idea for the responsibility principle isn't that this principle is competing with the categorical imperative or the principle about maximizing happiness. Rather, Freeman is just saying that whichever moral framework you select, utilitarianism, Kantian ethics, virtue ethics, whatever it might be, there's going to be something like this in the background. Okay, so clearly the responsibility principle is incompatible with the separation thesis. If business is separated from ethics, there is no question of moral responsibility for business decisions. More clearly still, without something like the responsibility principle, it is difficult to see how ethics gets off the ground. Responsibility may well be a difficult and multifaceted idea. There are surely many different ways to understand it, but if we are not willing to accept the responsibility for our own actions, as limited as that may be due to complicated issues of causality and the like, then ethics understood as how we reason together so that we can all flourish is likely an exercise in bad faith. If we want to give up the separation fallacy and adopt the integration thesis, if the open question argument makes sense, and if something like the responsibility thesis is necessary, then we need a new model for business. And this new story must be able to explain how value creation at once deals with economics and ethics, and how it takes account of all the effects of business actions on others. Such a model exists and has been developing over the last 30 years by management researchers and ethics scholars, and there are many businesses who have adopted this stakeholder framework for their businesses. Okay, so this section, the dominant model is not consistent with ethics, is a little tricky. So here I've outlined it, sort of the process that Freeman goes through in this section. So we start with the separation thesis, the idea that business decisions and ethical decisions are completely separate. Okay, from there we moved on to 1 through 4, the open question argument, which demonstrate that business decisions often do, at least implicitly, contain ethical content. So given 1 through 4, given that those questions make sense, we have to reject the separation thesis. Okay, so that gives us two options. First, ethics can be a side constraint that executives have to recognize while they are managing for shareholders. This is Freeman's position. Or ethical concerns are integrated into business decisions. So Freeman prefers integration over side constraint. Once we have the integration thesis, we need to know what ethics is. So Freeman discusses that at the bottom of column 1 on page 60. So he settles on the responsibility principle. So however we might want to characterize ethics, the responsibility principle is going to be part of it, Freeman says. And then finally, once we recognize the responsibility principle and have accepted the integration thesis and rejected the separation thesis, one model, maybe not the only one, for how executives should run their businesses is the stakeholder model. Okay, next section, managing for stakeholders. The basic idea of managing for stakeholders is quite simple. Business can be understood as a set of relationships among groups which have a stake in the activities that make up the business. Business is about how customers, suppliers, employees, financiers, that is stockholders, bondholders, banks, and so forth, communities, and managers interact and create value. To understand a business is to know how these relationships work, and the executive's or entrepreneur's job is to manage and shape these relationships, hence the title, Managing for Stakeholders. Figure 1, okay, here, depicts the idea of managing for stakeholders in a variation of the classic wheel and spoke diagram. However, it is important to note that the stakeholder idea is perfectly general. Corporations are not the center of the universe, and there are many possible pictures. One might put customers in the center to signal that a company puts its customers as the key priority. Another might put employees in the center and link them to customers and shareholders. We prefer the generic diagram because it suggests pictorially that managing for stakeholders is a theory about management and business, hence managers and companies are in the center. But there's no larger metaphysical claim here.